Today, the world mourns but also celebrates the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela. He was a symbol of struggle and triumph. He passed away yesterday at the age of 95. In this hour, we talk with politicians, entertainers, friends, and those whose lives the man called Mandela touched. Next on this special edition of News One Now. This morning here in the United States, the nation's capital, the flags are flying at half-staff. This is in honor of the man who spent the lion's share of his life fighting for the freedom of his brothers and sisters in South Africa, but also freeing folks across the world. Folks, welcome to TV1's extensive coverage of the passing of Nelson Mandela. We have a packed show lined up for you today, a number of guests, a number of folks joining me here on the set. But first, we want to share with you what President Barack Obama had to say yesterday after the news was confirmed by South African President Jacob Zuma that Nelson Mandela had passed away.
He achieved more than could be expected of any man. And today he's gone home. And we've lost one of the most influential, courageous, and profoundly good human beings that any of us will share time with on this earth.
As I said, we've got a packed show, and later in the show, we'll be hearing from Dr. Cornel West and Hill Harper and Ambassador Andrew Young, and also from John Legend, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Marsha Fudge, Charles Ogletree, a number of folks. But right now, we're joined by a distinguished panel. To my right is Armstrong Williams. He is the host of The Right Side. Also to my left, we have H. Patrick Swigert. He is the former president of Howard University. Also, former Congressman Ron Dellums. He's also the former mayor of Oakland, and George Curry of the NNPA. All four of them. They have, over the years, been to South Africa. They've met Nelson Mandela, and they will certainly share their insights. And gentlemen, first of all, thank you so very much for being with us. What really jumps out to me, and it's amazing as I look at all of this coverage, and they're talking about how graceful Nelson Mandela was and how iconic he was. At his heart, he was a radical revolutionary.
If you go to Lily's Leaf, that's where the farm outside of where he was really, they were plotting the overthrow of the government, you'll see all kind of symbols there of what he was like. Look, first they tried nonviolence, and it was totally repressive. He said, we got to fight fire with fire. And he was determined, he was a revolutionary, and that he could go beyond that and become the unifier that he was is remarkable.
Well, the thing that, as an attorney, when he was tried, his trial in Ravenna, he spoke as words that are reminiscent to us as Americans. Namely, he said, I will give my life for my cause. And he, not only did he mean it, but he lived it for the next 27 years when he was found guilty of subversion and committed to the penitentiary and then later at Robbins Island. He was not simply a radical, he was an intellect. And he imbued the struggle with an intellectual context. And the context of another South African, frankly, before he spoke to, as George Curry just mentioned, the idea of perhaps struggle, armed struggle, Mahatma Gandhi, who was also a South African. And he took lessons from all sources to bring an intellectual basis to the struggle. I
know you brought up intellect, nothing against Armstrong and Ron Dellums, but I got somebody on the phone line who embodies intellect, Dr. Cornel West. He's a scholar, author, and commentator. And Dr. West, your impressions of Nelson Mandela and what should the world most remember about this courageous man?
He was a spiritual giant. He was a moral titan. He was a Christian who was also a political revolutionary who understood when the CIA collaborated with the apartheid regime to find him underground and on the terrorist list of the United States government up until 2008. Thank God for Dellums and others telling that truth, that he could still stand tall, still love, still embrace, but most importantly, rooted in a fundamental commitment to justice.
Gentlemen, one of the most important things, I think, when you talk about South Africa and the fight against apartheid is that entertainers played a critical role in that. You think back to Harry Belafonte and others going back to the 60s, and we reached out to Mr. Belafonte. He's traveling today. Hopefully we will have him next week. But one of the folks from the next generation who certainly understands the importance of activism and entertainment is actor Hill Harper, who joins us right now. And Hill, share with us your thoughts about Nelson Mandela.
Good morning, Roland. There's a few things that I think that all of us should remember and hopefully apply to our own lives about Nelson Mandela. And number one, the fact that he was a revolutionary. He was a freedom fighter. And we see the postcard image, but at the end of the day, he was someone that was deemed by his government as a terrorist, him along with Oliver Tambo and other leaders of the ANC. But he was so principled, he stood on principle, and he sacrificed so much. He was willing to sacrifice his life and being away from his family for the greater good. And so someone like that, who then comes out, is able to negotiate with his enemy, take that pain and the history of that pain and put it aside and negotiate and go from being an enemy of the state to head of state, go from being a freedom fighter to a statesman, is someone that is to me amazing. We got to see him live his life out. Unfortunately, there are other leaders that we can point to that are very similar. We never got to see them make it past into their 40s, let alone to 95. And so many of us can live like him and take his values and ideals and apply them to our life. It's just amazing to me.
Dr. West, in 30 seconds, the United States certainly was not always loving of Nelson Mandela.
The United States was on the wrong side of history. The United States, not just Reagan, but many Democrats as well, going from Kennedy all the way up to the present centrists in the Democratic Party who refused to see that white supremacy was just as evil as Nazism, that the apartheid regime had the same immoral status as Nazism, but Nelson Mandela, like Martin Luther King Jr., reminds us that love cuts through it all.
Hill Harper, Dr. Cornel West, we certainly appreciate you being with us. Thank you so very much for sharing your thoughts on TV One and News One Now.
Thank you so much.
When we come back from the break, folks, Armstrong Williams this year spent Thanksgiving with many of Nelson Mandela's relatives. We'll talk to him about that family connection. And also, Congressman Ron Dellums, he knows about being a radical. That's what they call him in Congress. We'll talk about the sanctions against South Africa. And the Congressional Black Caucus led that. And what was it like to be in those meetings, fighting that fight for more than 2 decades. Folks, 7 minutes after the hour, you're watching a special edition of News One Now right here on TV One.
Fellow South Africans, our beloved Nelson Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed. He passed on peacefully in the company of his family around 2050.
Folks, welcome back. That was South African President Jacob Zuma giving the news to the nation and the world, announcing the passing of Nelson Mandela on yesterday at the age of 95. And we continue our extensive coverage right here on TV One. I want to turn right now to a couple of guests in the studio with me, Armstrong Williams and also former Congressman Ron Dellums. And Armstrong, you hosted members of the family for Thanksgiving, and I guess it was around 3 p.m. yesterday. You got a call from the family saying that he had passed, and it really was a couple of hours later when the president came out and announced that to the rest of the world that he had passed away. So tell us about what transpired yesterday.
Well, the family were here. His daughter, Zanani Dlamini Mandela, is the ambassador of Venezuela, Paraguay, and Uruguay from South Africa. And in conjunction with the movie premieres,
The movie A Long Walk Home starring Idris Elba.
We hosted them for Thanksgiving and all the Mandela grandchildren on Thanksgiving evening. And even from the conversations with her, you could tell that her father was gravely ill and the time wasn't long. But you know, I just want to share this. I had lunch with Mr. Mandela 5 days after his release from Portsmouth. And I think what is important, I think what Professor Cornel West said about the morality is very important. Mandela said to me in his own words, he said, look, man, I was a sinner. I did a lot of things I had to do to free my people. He said, but you know, God transformed me in jail. I learned to love my enemies, those jailers, those bondsmen. They became some of my greatest allies. They brought me books. I was like a father to those guys. And then he also said, it's almost like biblical, like Moses and Abraham and David, how God used the worst of sinners to do his greatest work. And so for people who talk about his background, yes, all that is true, but he transformed, because a lot of people in South Africa wanted him to bring about violence, to punish the white man. But he said, no, he's forgiveness. We must transform and work together as a nation, not divided.
Ron Dellums, Armstrong talked about allies. He had few allies in Congress, but some of his strongest, Congressional Black Caucus. You guys had to go through a bitter fight over a 2-decade period when it came to sanctions. Take us through what that was like.
First of all, a little-known piece of history is that a group of, quote, militant Polaroid workers from New England came down to Washington, D.C. in late 1971. The Congressional Black Caucus, 13 members, had captured their imagination. Remember, the pass books that blacks had to show when they were challenged,
which essentially was like looked like a passport.
Exactly.
So they said, show me your papers.
Exactly. The picture was taken by Polaroid cameras. So the Polaroid workers, feeling very uncomfortable that they were working for an employer that was complicit in essentially support of the apartheid regime, wanted the Congressional Black Caucus to introduce a piece of legislation dealing with divestment. The caucus that particular day had an ambitious agenda, and they said, Ron, would you go meet with the Polaroid workers? And I said, of course I would. John Conyers got up and said, I will go with him. That started the journey of the divestment bill that took 15 to 17 years of work. But it was a group of Polaroid workers who had the dignity and the integrity to challenge the Congressional Black Caucus, and we made that commitment.
And I want to say this, Ken Williams was one of those leaders, and Caroline Hunter, who is now known as Caroline Williams. And in fact, it's interesting, I stayed at her house on Martha's Vineyard, and I'm in New York last year watching a documentary, and I'm seeing this story, and I go, wait a minute, I stayed at her house. And so I text her daughter saying, wow, I did not realize that's who your mom was. And so, folks, we're actually going to have her on the show next week talking actually about that. I want to go to the phones right now. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from D.C. joins us right now. Congresswoman, your thoughts about the passing of Nelson Mandela?
Oh, my goodness. Good morning. I have to tell you that while Ron Dellums and the Black Caucus were fighting and trying to get the administration to support sanctions, I was on the outside of the Congress in the Free Mandela movement, and I suppose when I heard that he had passed, I remembered when 4 of us went into the embassy to try to get 8 trade unionists who were being held incommunicado, who were really the Free South Africa movement inside of South Africa, to get them released, and that's when the arrests began. People came from all over the United States, people who were well-known, people who nobody knew, and the Free South Africa movement grew, and the movement for divestment grew, and ultimately the United States finally agreed to sanctions, and the end of apartheid was then in the wind. And I happened to be in Cape Town on the day he was released. I was then a professor at Georgetown, but I was a member of the Rockefeller Foundation board, and the last thing I expected was the announcement that Mandela would be released. So I have seen his journey from the time he was released, 71 years old, until this year in the Congress, when we celebrated bringing Democrats and Republicans together, the entire leadership of the Congress celebrated the 95th birthday of Nelson Mandela. That's the full journey that I've seen during my lifetime of Nelson Mandela, a man who grew to great prominence when nobody knew him. No one had ever met him, but when he became the symbol of freedom in the world. And there has never been a political figure like him in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
When they say father of his country, I really think of George Washington, who served one term and refused to serve another. So did Nelson Mandela. Now, when was the last time you saw a government official give up power?
Absolutely.
Like that?
Congresswoman Norton, we certainly appreciate you sharing your reflections regarding Nelson Mandela. Thank you so very much. Folks, we've got to take a break right now. When we come back, we will talk with former Ambassador Andrew Young about the connection between the civil rights movement here in the United States and the anti-apartheid movement there. And he will also share with us the link between Dr. King and anti-apartheid fighters in South Africa. You can give us your thoughts and your memories with regards to Nelson Mandela by going to our News One Now Facebook page. You can also tweet us at News One, also at Roland S. Martin. So, folks, stay tuned. We'll have more coverage on the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela on this special edition of TV1's News One Now, 20 after the hour.
So that we form a solid phalanx against racism to ensure that that day comes now. By our common actions, let us ensure that justice triumphs without delay. When that has come to pass, then shall we all be entitled to acknowledge the salute when others say of us, "Blessed are the peacemakers."
Folks, welcome back to TV1's live coverage of the passing of former South African President Nelson Mandela. We have had a number of folks sharing their thoughts about him, this iconic figure. Joining us on the phone lines right now is the former ambassador to the United Nations for the United States and also former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young. Ambassador Young, welcome to News One Now.
How you doing?
Great talking with you. There was a clear connection between leaders in South Africa and the civil rights movement here in the United States.
You know, it went all the way back to Chief Albert Luthuli, the founder of the ANC, and Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela as young men. But the ANC was founded, and all of them actually went to the same kind of historically black colleges that we went to in these countries. So I knew about Albert Luthuli and the ANC from Sunday school. And Nelson Mandela went to Fort Hare University, which was one of the colleges that the Methodist and Congregational and Presbyterian churches founded. We shared a common legacy of both oppression and also a kind of biblical hope. And when Albert Luthuli got the Nobel Prize in the 50s, Dr. King was one of the first to congratulate him. And when Martin won in 1964, they collaborated on a general human rights proclamation that went around the world. But it was even more subtle than that. When the freedom rides were going on here, and it hit television, the Sharpeville, they call it the Sharpeville riots. It was really the police turning on people in Sharpeville and killing them. But there seemed to be, every time we had a movement here, there was a parallel explosion of some sort that occurred in South Africa. So it's as though we were connected at the hip.
Well, Ambassador Young, first of all, we thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts about Nelson Mandela. And over the next 10 days, of course, we will continue our coverage, letting people know about who this man was, a 360-degree view of him and not just a narrow view. We appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Ron Dellums, you wanted to pick up on a point, something Armstrong said earlier.
Yes, I did. You showed a clip of Nelson Mandela speaking to a joint session of Congress.
1990, when he came visiting the
I
United
had
States.
the honor of escorting him to the floor of Congress. After that speech, he told a story at a luncheon that I think speaks to the point that Armstrong made. He said that when he was arrested in the context of South Africa and went to Robben Island, the races were so polarized that they could not develop a relationship. He goes to prison, and to his shock and amazement, an extraordinary debate begins to occur among his white jailers. One group said, continue to oppress them, treat them harshly, so that when they get out, they'll never want to come back, they'll never fight against apartheid again. But there was a second group of people that said, no, we may reap what we sow. And if we, someday, blacks will become the leaders of South Africa, and if we want them to treat us with dignity and respect, we must treat them with dignity and respect. His point was that in prison, in this counterintuitive, isolated place, blacks and whites began to sense each other's humanity. And he thus came out of Robben Island a transformed human being, because in the prison, he was able to relate to and sense the humanity of his white jailers.
George?
I think he also spoke about when you have hate, it eats up you and doesn't affect the other person. And that's why when he talked about it, he walked out, he left it behind him because he could never go forward. And I think that's an amazing lesson for all of us.
You know, we talk about Mr. Mandela, and I think context is so important. And I'm happy that Ambassador Young referenced the founders of ANC and their shared intellectual and cultural relationship one with another as graduates of what in this country we called historically black institutions, historically black schools and colleges. And I'm particularly happy to hear that coming from Andrew Young, Ambassador Young, a graduate of Howard University, let me be quick to add. But when you visit South Africa, you really could appreciate the sense of both the Africana community and the majority community. Namely, here's someone who in the South African context, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And you know, we don't have that. And we're not going to have that, in my view, at any time soon, unfortunately. A personality who, when I first met him, you know, you think of iconic figures, and therefore you think you're visiting a statue or someone frozen in time. And I'm so happy that our colleagues on this panel have humanized him. When I met him, what occurred to me was, what am I going to say after hello? and thank you for greeting me. Well, what I found, as Armstrong found with his family and hosting his family, what I found was a very, very warm human being, which was almost, in a funny kind of way, a disappointment. You know, I wanted a mountaintop, you know, and we talked, and I was fortunate enough, I was scheduled to visit with him for 5 minutes, a stop and go, and I visited with him for an hour. And one aside in terms of his humanity. I met him my last day in South Africa, and I didn't know what I could bring him. I had sort of run out of gifts because I had run around the country. The only thing I had left was a Howard baseball cap. I gave him the baseball cap, and here's someone, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and right. I'm giving him a baseball cap. He took the cap and said, you know, I've always wanted a Howard baseball cap. And of course, he was pulling my leg, but it was...
That's a smooth politician right there for you. Folks, speaking of smooth politicians, coming up next, we'll talk with Congresswoman Marsha Fudge, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, to get her thoughts on Nelson Mandela. I specifically want to hear from her about Nelson Mandela understanding why women should play a leadership role in the movement, which a lot of civil rights leaders didn't necessarily embrace in this country. Folks, 28 before the top of the hour. Hit us up on Twitter as well as on Facebook. We'll take your comments. This is News 1 Now with Roland Martin and our special coverage on the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela. Pictures you were seeing, of course, of South Africans. It's interesting when you talk about Nelson Mandela dying, but in many ways they are celebrating his passing. And so it's been very interesting and warming to see them singing and chanting and showing their love and affection for a huge, huge figure. Social media, there was a tremendous outpouring yesterday, and it continues as it relates to Nelson Mandela. News One Now, Shannon Cross joins us right now with what's happening in the social media world. So Shannon, lots of high-profile people weighing in, but of course regular, ordinary folks as well saying why they love Nelson Mandela.
That's right, Roland. You've got politicians, entertainers, and journalists all weighing in. We have singer Rihanna with this tweet. Nelson Mandela, you made your people proud. We'll always love you for it. And Russell Simmons with this quote from Mandela, the greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Rest in peace, Nelson Mandela. Whoopi Goldberg tweeted this, I want to give the world a hug. I was told Mandiba just passed. Nelson Mandela, rest in peace. Time for a well-earned sleep. Condolences to his family. And comedian Kevin Hart with this tweet, the definition of strength is Nelson Mandela. Hashtag rest in peace, hashtag greatness, hashtag icon. And Tyler Perry with this, what a life, what a journey, what a man. Thank you for passing this way. God bless your resting soul. And ESPN's Stephen A. Smith with this tweet, thank you, my Lord, for giving us Nelson Mandela. Rest in eternal peace. And actor Idris Elba, who plays Nelson Mandela in A Long Walk to Freedom, simply tweeted, merci, which in French means thank you.
Well, Shannon, I'll tell you what, it was very interesting yesterday looking at the coverage, because before Zuma came out and made the announcement, it was interesting just seeing folks who were actually there talking about folks who were showing up at the home and the police presence. And so that's why I think social media has played such a critical role. So as opposed to you waiting on a news agency to let you know what was happening, you had folks who in real time who were sharing those thoughts. And also there were a lot of folks who were posting their photos they took with Nelson Mandela, John Legend, and others. And so over the coming days, we'll be sharing those photos as well. Shannon Cross, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Folks, on the phone line right now is Congresswoman Marcia Fudge of Ohio. She is chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And Congresswoman Fudge, when we talk about Nelson Mandela, we talk about the ANC. One of the things that I think people often forget, and when I interviewed Winnie Mandela, she talked about this, and that is the role that women leaders played in carrying forth that torch, as well as the young folks in South Africa, the children who are vital to ending apartheid.
I mean, clearly, Winnie Mandela was the face of the movement for most of the 27 years that President Mandela was imprisoned. And in this country, if you think about what people in the Black Caucus did, and I'm so glad that you had Ron Dellums on, because he was probably one of the most influential people in trying to do away with apartheid of any person in the Congress of the United States. But we had Maxine Waters. Maxine Waters was the face of the ANC in this country. As a matter of fact, became a member of the ANC when it was still considered a terrorist organization. People like Barbara Lee, who traveled to other countries to meet with people that were helping to tear down the apartheid regime because she couldn't do it in this country. Women and young people really carried the banner when other people were afraid or did not find that they had the position or the strength to do some of the things that were done while he was in prison. And so women really were the face of the movement for many, many years.
Congresswoman Fudge, we certainly thank you for sharing your thoughts with regards to Nelson Mandela. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Armstrong, we were talking in the break, and Nelson Mandela was not one to not speak to what was happening here in the United States.
No, I have to give credit to Bob Brown in High Point, North Carolina, who really took care of his children and educated them while he was in prison. It was through him that I've gained my access. I think the funniest thing about talking to Mr. Mandela, he said, stop with the politics. Let's talk about the U.S. He made those transitions quickly, and he talked about what sustained him, and he said gospel music. I said, well, what do you know about gospel music? and in prison, he said, Shirley Caesar, Jesus, I love calling your name. I almost fell out. I couldn't believe it. And then he loved boxing. He loved Mike Tyson.
He was a boxer.
He loved Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali. I was stunned how much American culture influenced him and how much he loved gospel music. Not just loving it, but knowing the songs and could recite the lyrics. I was just blown away by it.
He also had a tremendous sense of humor. I love the photos, and you have one of those where he's laughing.
Yes. Well, I have a photo. I don't know whether you can pick it up, but I had just told him about my ill-fated career in athletics, and he just threw his head back and laughed, and he was quick to say that he was not laughing at my failure to be an athlete, but he was thinking about all of the athletes that he knew who wanted to be what he wanted to be, namely a real athlete, which is one of his aspirations, which was stunted, of course. And you know, I wanted to talk about law, and of course he was a lawyer, and he wanted to come back to my athletic misadventures.
Ron.
You know, one of his fantasies was, and he said to me, you know, I wanted to be a heavyweight champion of the world. So
when he was boxing, he was 245.
Yeah.
And that was big. That was big back then for boxers.
Exactly. I would just like to offer this one observation. Martin Luther King said once that longevity has its place. I would love to live a long life, but he didn't live a long life. But he gave us a picture of the power of peace and the power of nonviolence. Nelson Mandela was given the gift of longevity, and he not only showed a vision of it, he showed us how to do it. And that was the difference, in my opinion, between Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King.
Great point. Folks, we come back from this break, we'll talk with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and we also chat with Harvard professor Charles Ogletree, who led the effort when it came to lining up those lawyers to bail folks out of jail who were fighting apartheid when it came to those sanctions. Folks, it is 16 for the top of the hour. You're looking at a live picture outside of the home of Nelson Mandela. This is News 1 Now with Roland Martin. Back in a moment.
Apartheid was so vicious at the time. I did not blame any of those who were too afraid. Someone had to carry the banner.
That was an interview I conducted with Winnie Mandela just a couple of years ago when she came to the United States and spoke at a church in Birmingham, Alabama. Joining us on the phone right now is Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California. She's a frequent traveler to South Africa, and she also knew Nelson Mandela personally. Congresswoman Lee, welcome to News 1 Now.
Happy to be with you today, Ron.
What is the one memory that stands out for you as it relates to Nelson Mandela, the man?
When he came to Washington, D.C. several years ago to just say thank you, his humility, his serenity, but yet his ability to demonstrate to all of us that as a freedom fighter and one who fought for justice and for freedom, that one should remain humble and one should move forward, and in the development of multiracial society, do it in a way that allows for the healing. And his presence, whenever I was in his presence, I think many people will say that he was larger than life, and you felt that sense of serenity, peace, and calm, but yet strength, and knew that you were with a magnificent human being.
I called Randall Robinson yesterday. He was the leader, of course, of Trans Africa, and he was traveling and couldn't join us, and so we'll try to get him next week. But he said, one person I want you to call is Harvard professor Charles Ogletree. He said because it was his efforts when it came to the trying to get the sanctions against that government. He said, we called Tree and said, look, I need you to line the lawyers up and have them ready, because when folks start protesting at South African embassies across the country, we're going to need lawyers to bail them out of jail. And Professor Ogletree joins us right now. Tree, talk about how critically important it was to have black politicians, black lawyers, black activists, and others all united when it came to helping Nelson Mandela and the ANC bring down the racist apartheid government in South Africa.
Roland, it was very critical. Thank you for having me on. The reality is that I started supporting Mandela before I knew he was Mandela. What do I mean by that? I was a student at Stanford, and we had a protest against apartheid in 1972. Talking about what I held a sign up saying, "Let my people go," and it continued in law school. And then when I got connected with Randall Robinson, I was on this board at Trans-Africa. And Randall said that Ogletree is going to lead this movement. I said, what? So we had a bunch of folks, and we decided to, black lawyers, black students, black clergy, black business leaders, we were all getting together to march in 1984 for Nelson Mandela's freedom, and it made a big difference. And because we had to make sure that people understood that we were there to stay. And I visited South Africa several times. I met Nelson Mandela several times. I'll be happy to talk about that. But I have to say that he's a man of courage, of an incredible will, and he will be remembered. I just hope this group here, I shouldn't be volunteering it, but we should write a book called I Am Nelson Mandela. That's not being arrogant. People may remember the movie about Malcolm X, where Nelson Mandela did a video at the end saying, I am Malcolm X. We have to be him, his spirit, his commitment, his courage, and his infallibility. And I think that's what I hope we'll do in the 21st century. We will forever remember this man, not just as a global figure, but as someone who should have a national and a global holiday to recognize his birth and his 95 years of service to a great country.
Professor Ogletree, Congresswoman Lee, would certainly thank you for sharing your thoughts about Nelson Mandela with us here on TV1's News One Now. I want to go back to our panel. We have Ron Dellums, Patrick Swigert, George Curry, and Armstrong Williams here. Got to be a tough act to follow if you had to be the president after Nelson Mandela served.
You are kidding. I wouldn't want that. Even try to do that. But you had with Mbeki, who succeeded him, who was pretty much kind of ex-official president anyway, because Mandela delegated a lot of the obligations to him. But Mbeki came there, and he had problems, you know, acknowledging the HIV and AIDS existed there, in which President Mandela chastised him for. And then you even got Zuma after that, and there's a disenchantment with the ANC. I think they had so much high expectations there. But that's a disenchantment to the point now that Bishop Tutu say he won't support him in the next election because people expected so much. When you go back, so little has changed economically, and that's a challenge.
Let me
Patrick and then Armstrong.
We awarded an honorary degree to Mr. Mandela. We also awarded an honorary degree to Thabo Mbeki. At the time, by the way, Mr. Mbeki presented a plaque to Howard to acknowledge the colleges and universities that had been engaged in anti-apartheid movement. It's down in our Founders Library at the University at Howard. Mr. Mbeki had a very difficult task ahead of him. And his task was not simply to succeed a personality, a physical person, but someone who embodied an ideal South Africa, an ideal that has not been fully realized. And I'm not sure anyone could have fulfilled the aspirations that were triggered by Mr. Mandela's triumph. And I think, you know, we sometimes overlook the task, the difficulty of the task confronting President Mbeki, but I do think we need to acknowledge what he did as well.
Armstrong, hold tight 1 second. We're going to get your comment when we come back. Folks, we first of all want to thank Congresswoman Lee for calling, and also Professor Charles Ogletree. 5 before the top of the hour. This is News One Now with Roland Martin and our continuing coverage on the life and legacy of South African President Nelson Mandela.
Since Comrade Madiba is in his final years in his life, some of us have to continue for as long as we still have the energy to do so, to fulfill the dreams every one of us fought for.
That was my interview with Winnie Mandela just a couple of years ago. Welcome back to TV1 News One Now and our coverage on the passing of Nelson Mandela. Joining us on the phone right now is the former president and CEO of the NAACP, also former congressman from Maryland, Kwesi Mfume. Kwesi, welcome to News One Now.
Thank you very much.
What did Nelson Mandela mean to you?
Well, Nelson Mandela treated me like a son, and I admired him as you would a father. But more than anything, what he's meant to me and the world is that in his passing, we've witnessed one of the greatest figures of human history leaving the stage of life, who, through the simple eloquence of his example, inspired presidents, popes, and the common man to a legacy and a belief that good would always overcome evil. And so much has been said and so much will continue to be said, but I just hope that we all personally hold him in our hearts and remember that we are all, and the nation is better because he lived.
Kwaiza, we certainly appreciate you joining us here on News One Now. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Roland.
Final thoughts. Let me start to my right, Armstrong Williams.
You know, Mandela is a powerful symbol, but the person that holds South Africa together and keeps it from becoming a tinderbox is Winnie Mandela. Mr. Mandela may have been the president, but she is the general. She is a warrior. She is tough. You've heard the stories. And she has the respect and the trust of the people. And as long as she lives, you won't see the chaos that could ensue at the possibility of Mr. Mandela dying.
Patrick Swigert?
Well, I think of him as a giant both of intellect and humanity, which is a combination that's rare to find anywhere at any time. And I think his ideal, the ideal of Mr. Mandela, is so powerful that it will continue to thrive.
George Curry.
I think, you know, his life challenged us to be courageous, to find something we believe in and willing to die for.
Final comment, Ron Dellums.
I want to share a personal moment. Nelson Mandela is free from Robben Island. He goes to Lusaka, Zambia, meets with ANC. That morning, I'm suddenly going to meet Nelson Mandela after I had been saying, free Mandela, free my people, free South Africa. Bill Gray, who passed away, says, Mr. Mandela, I'd like you to meet Congressman Ron Dellums. He turns to me and he said, we have heard much of you. You gave us hope. You kept us alive. And he hugged me, and I just broke down and cried. That's the most powerful moment. If I lived to be 1,000, I would never forget the power of that moment.
We want to thank, first of all of you for being with us and everyone who called in and shared their thoughts about Nelson Mandela. The next 10 days is a mourning period. The funeral will be held on December 15th. We will continue to have coverage as it relates to the passing of Nelson Mandela. Be sure to go to news1.com for more stories and updates. Of course, you can also check me out at RolandSMartin.com and follow us on Twitter at RolandSMartin and News1. Be sure to watch TV One. We have various coverage this weekend, various documentaries on Nelson Mandela. Folks, we will see you next week. For all of us here at TV One, thank you so very much for watching this special edition focused on the life and legacy of the iconic and the great Nelson Mandela.